You mastered the silence, that much is certain. You built it into something almost architectural, a structure so complete and so consistent that the people who tried to reach through it eventually stopped trying, and the stopping confirmed what the silence was always quietly arguing: that distance is safer than presence, that walls are more reliable than people, that the controlled quiet of self-containment is preferable to the uncontrolled vulnerability of genuine contact. You mastered the silence, and you lived in it, and you told yourself, in whatever language the interior uses when it is justifying its own most costly choices, that the silence was strength. But there is something coming for the avoidant that the silence cannot prepare them for. Something that does not announce itself, does not arrive with the urgency that would permit preparation, does not give the defense system adequate warning to construct the appropriate response before it has already landed. It arrives quietly, almost gently, and it hurts with a precision and a depth that the silence, for all its considerable power as a self-protective mechanism, never could. It is not an argument. It is not a confrontation. It is not the tears or the anger or the carefully constructed final message that explains exactly what the withdrawal cost. It is none of the external events the avoidant has been, consciously or not, bracing against throughout the duration of their retreat. It is the moment they realize you are genuinely fine without them. Not performing fine. Not the brittle, barely held together fine of someone who is managing the surface while the interior continues to process the weight of what the relationship was and what it failed to become. Not the fine that is actually a different word for waiting, waiting for them to return, waiting for acknowledgement, waiting for the resolution that the dynamic withheld. Not that fine. The real thing. The fine that has no audience. The fine that exists in the ordinary, unremarkable, fully inhabited texture of a life that has reorganized itself genuinely and thoroughly around its own center, rather than around the avoidant's absence. The fine that shows up not in what is said, but in what is no longer being said, in the absence of the reaching, the absence of the monitoring, the absence of the particular orientation toward them that the avoidant's nervous system had, without fully acknowledging it, been quietly relying on. That fine is the thing that hurts more than any silence ever could. Because the silence was theirs, they controlled it, they chose it, they maintained it from the position of someone who believed, at some level, that the belief operated, that the choosing and the maintaining meant something about the power dynamic of the ending, that the quiet exit was a form of control, that the disappearance without explanation was, if not exactly strength, then at least the avoidant's particular version of it, the management of an ending on their own terms, in their own time, without the vulnerability of a conversation that might have cost them something. And your fine dismantles all of that, quietly, without argument, without confrontation, without requiring anything of them at all, simply by being real. The dismantling happens because the avoidant silence was never actually about indifference. This is the piece that the silence worked very hard to conceal, from you, and perhaps most effectively from themselves. The silence was not the expression of someone who had genuinely processed the connection, genuinely moved through whatever the relationship was, and genuinely arrived at a place of settled resolution that permitted them to move forward without looking back. The silence was management, of something that did not resolve simply because contact was cut, of a connection that continued to exist in the interior regardless of what the exterior was doing about it, of the specific, irreplaceable quality of what was between you, which did not, as the avoidant silence implicitly argued it would, simply fade in the absence of contact into something manageable and eventually negligible. The avoidant silence was built on an assumption, the assumption that your continued suffering, your continued orientation toward them, your continued carrying of the weight of the unresolved ending would be the other side of the equation. That while they managed the interior with their customary tools, you would be managing yours with the customary tools of someone who has been left without explanation. The grief, the confusion, the reaching toward resolution, the ongoing allocation of significant emotional resources in the direction of someone who had withdrawn. Your fine removes the other side of the equation, and an equation with only one side is not an equation. It is simply the avoidant, alone with what they chose, without the counterweight of your continued suffering to make the silence feel like a balanced response to a shared situation. What they feel when the fine becomes undeniable is something they do not have a sophisticated vocabulary for, because it is not a feeling their relational history has required them to process before. It is not grief in the ordinary sense, though it contains grief. It is not regret in the simple sense, though it contains regret. It is something more specific and more uncomfortable than either of those. It is the feeling of having been the one who left a room and then discovered that the room continued, warmly, fully, with genuine light and genuine life in their absence. That the room did not dim, did not go quiet, did not organize itself around the fact of their not being in it. That the room, in fact, is more genuinely inhabited now than it was when the dynamic was running, and your energy was being disproportionately spent on the management of someone whose presence was intermittent and whose absence was consuming. They expected, not consciously, not as a deliberate expectation, but in the way that the avoidance relational psychology tends to generate expectations about the aftermath of their exits, that the absence would be felt as absence. That the withdrawal would register, on your end, as a loss that continued to be actively experienced as loss. That the silence on their end would produce a corresponding silence on yours, a diminishment, a waiting, an orientation toward the space they left that would persist until they chose to fill it. What they got instead is you, building something in the space. Something genuine and growing and entirely your own. Something that, observed from the distance that the avoidant chose, looks unmistakably like a person who has not only survived the ending, but has used it as the beginning of something that has no place for the avoidant in it. Not because you are punishing them, because you genuinely, organically, without performance, moved on. The moving on is the thing that lands differently than anything else the dynamic produced. Because everything else, your reaching, your grief, your expressions of what the withdrawal cost you, could be managed by the avoidance defense system with relative competence. These were experiences the system had prepared for. Emotional expression from the person being left was anticipated. Grief was anticipated. The pursuit of resolution was anticipated. The system had responses for all of these things. Maintain the distance, minimize the engagement, let the intensity pass, trust that the withdrawal will eventually produce acceptance. Your genuine thriving was not anticipated. Your genuine thriving has no prepared response. Because the defense system was built to manage intimacy, not to manage the specific, destabilizing reality of someone for whom the intimacy was offered and withdrawn becoming, in the absence of it, more themselves than they were in the presence of it. That is not a scenario the avoidance psychology saw coming. That is not a scenario their relational history gave them a template for. And so the thriving lands without a buffer, without the management infrastructure that softens everything else, directly, with a precision that goes beneath the defenses, because it did not come from the direction the defenses were facing. What it reaches is the specific interior question that the avoidant has been least willing to sit with. Not whether they hurt you, the breaking point already forced that reckoning. Not whether they could have been different, the silence produced that awareness at its own pace. The question your genuine find reaches is the one that sits underneath all the others. Was it worth it? Was the distance worth this? Was the silence worth the specific, concrete, now undeniable cost of watching someone who genuinely loved them become genuinely fine in the absence of them? Was the self-protection worth the self-defeat? Was the plan, the always keep distance, always manage the depth, always maintain enough separation that the system feels safe plan, was the plan worth what it actually produced? Not in the abstract, in the specific terms of the person they are watching be fine. The person who offered something real and was met with management. The person who stayed through things that would have sent others away and was met with withdrawal. The person who saw the actual version and responded with warmth and was met with the silence that was supposed to protect the avoidant from exactly what the warmth was offering. And who is now, unambiguously and without performance, fine. The answer the avoidant finds in that question, if they allow themselves to actually sit with it rather than manage past it with the usual tools, is not comfortable. It does not vindicate the plan. It does not produce the settled sense of having made the right choices that genuine self-sufficiency is supposed to provide. It produces something that the plan was specifically designed to prevent producing. The clear, unmediated, impossible to argument away recognition that the cost of the self-protection exceeded the cost of the vulnerability it was protecting against. That they were more harmed by the closing than they would have been by the opening. That the silence cost more than the conversation would have. That the distance produced the very thing it was built to prevent, a specific and significant loss, while also producing the additional unintended thing that the plan never accounted for. The loss of someone who, it turns out, was capable of being fine without them, which means the loss is real, which means the connection was real, which means the silence was not the sophisticated, self-protective, ultimately reasonable response to an unmanageable situation. It was a choice, with consequences, fully arrived. You are not responsible for managing what this produces in them. You are not responsible for monitoring whether the reckoning is occurring. You are not responsible for being available to receive whatever the reckoning eventually generates in the way of reaching out or acknowledgement or the belated accountability that the breaking point sometimes produces. You are responsible for exactly one thing in all of this: continuing to be fine. Not as a message sent to them, not as the performance of thriving designed to produce a specific response, but as the genuine, ongoing, fully inhabited reality of a person who made the decision to return to herself and has been, every day since, more genuinely herself than the dynamic permitted. That fine is not for them. It never was. It is for you. It is the life you are living, fully, without apology, without the portion of yourself kept in waiting, without the orientation toward someone whose silence argued you were not worth the conversation. You were always worth the conversation. The fine is the evidence, and it hurts them more than any silence ever could, not because you intended it to, not because pain was the point, but because truth, embodied fully and without performance in the actual texture of a life being genuinely lived, always does. The life being genuinely lived does not require an audience to be real. That is perhaps the most important thing to hold as this particular chapter of the examination reaches its natural resting place. Because everything that has been explored here, the psychology, the patterns, the interior experience of both the avoidant and the person who loved them, the grief and the reclaiming and the discernment and the returning, all of it has been in service of one thing. Not the understanding of the avoidant, the understanding of yourself. And the understanding of yourself, fully arrived at and genuinely lived from, does not need to be witnessed by the person whose inability to witness it was the original wound. There is a temptation, in the aftermath of everything this kind of experience produces, to want the understanding to be seen, to want the growth to be acknowledged, to want the person whose limitations cost you so much to somehow perceive the full, clarified, genuinely inhabitable version of yourself that their limitations were, paradoxically, instrumental in producing. The wanting is understandable. It is the ordinary, human, entirely forgivable desire for the person who knew you in the diminished, dynamic, constrained version to encounter the full version and understand the difference, to register what they had access to and what the pattern prevented them from fully receiving. That witnessing will almost certainly not come in any form you can use, and needing it is the last remaining thread of the orientation toward them that the rest of this work has been carefully, genuinely, productively releasing. The full fine, the genuine non-performed, no audience required fine, includes releasing that too. The desire for them to see what they missed, the hope that the breaking point produced enough reckoning that the seeing might eventually occur. The quiet, residual orientation toward their perception of you as the final confirmation of the value you have spent this entire journey learning to locate within yourself. Within yourself is where it was always located, not as a philosophical position, as a functional, operational, daily lived reality. The value that the avoidance pattern spent so long implicitly arguing against, that your depth was too much, that your reaching was excessive, that the full version of you was more than the available relational context could accommodate, that value was never actually diminished by the argument. It was only ever obscured by it, hidden behind the accumulated weight of repeated not being met until the not being met began to feel like information about you rather than information about the specific, limited, defended context in which it was occurring. It was never information about you. It was always information about the context. And context is not destiny. Context is simply the specific set of conditions operating in a particular relational situation at a particular point in time. Conditions that can change, that are not universal, that reflect the specific psychological architecture of a specific person, rather than anything fundamental about the worth of the person they could not meet. The avoidant could not meet you. That is a statement about the avoidant. It contains no information about whether you are meetable, receivable, worth the meeting, worth the receiving. Those things are not determined by whether a specific and defended person was capable of providing them. They are determined by what you actually are. And what you actually are, the full, unedited, nobody's limitations can diminish it reality of your own nature, is precisely what this entire journey has been recovering access to. The recovery is not complete. It is important to say that clearly, rather than arriving at a false resolution that papers over the ongoing nature of what genuine psychological growth actually requires. You are not finished. The work does not reach a point of completion, after which nothing further is asked. The reclaiming is real and significant, and genuinely advances from where it began. But it is also ongoing, a practice rather than a destination, a direction rather than an arrival point. And the practice will continue to ask things of you that the current version of you is more equipped to offer than the version who entered the dynamic, but that still require the continued, conscious, self-respecting attention of someone who understands that growth does not maintain itself without the ongoing willingness to keep showing up for it. What showing up for it looks like from here is quieter than what it looked like earlier in the journey. The acute phases, the leaving, the no contact, the grief, the reclaiming, those had a visible intensity, an urgency, a quality of active, effortful engagement that was appropriate to what they were requiring. What the ongoing practice requires is something more subtle. The daily, unremarkable, not at all dramatic commitment to remaining genuinely present in your own life. To noticing when the attention drifts toward the old territory, toward him, toward the question of his reckoning, toward the residual hope that the fine is being witnessed and producing in him what you imagine it might produce, and returning, gently and without self-criticism, to what is actually here. What is actually here is worth returning to. That is not a consolation. It is the thing the entire journey has been building toward, the genuine, lived, increasingly confirmed recognition that here, in the actual texture of your own life, there is enough, more than enough. A richness of experience and connection and creative and intellectual engagement and ordinary pleasure that the dynamics consuming occupation of your interior was consistently pulling you away from, and that is now, in the genuine space of its full availability to you, revealing itself to be more sustaining than the intensity of the dynamic ever was. Sustaining is the word worth sitting with, because the avoidant dynamic, for all its consuming intensity, was not sustaining. It was activating. It produced the specific, adrenaline-adjacent quality of heightened alertness and intermittent reward that the nervous system can mistake for aliveness. But activation is not sustenance. The heightened alertness of chronic uncertainty is not the same as genuine engagement with a life that nourishes. The intermittent reward of occasional warmth from an emotionally unavailable person is not the same as the steady, reliable, quietly profound nourishment of genuine reciprocal connection. You know the difference now. In the body. In the way the two things actually feel. Rather than in any theoretical distinction between them, you have lived both, the activation that masquerades as aliveness and the genuine sustenance that does not announce itself with the same urgency, but that feeds something real and deep in the way that activation, however compelling, never quite does. And knowing the difference in the body is a different and more useful form of knowledge than knowing it conceptually. It is the knowledge that guides actual choices, that recognizes in real time when a new dynamic is offering activation dressed as depth, and when it is offering the quieter, less immediately compelling, but genuinely more nourishing alternative. That recognition is protection, not the protection of closure. Closure is not available in the absolute form the fearful part of you might prefer, and pursuing it tends to produce its own form of the avoidance that this entire examination has been tracing. The protection of clear seeing. Of an instrument calibrated, through the specific and difficult education of the experience you have been through, to read the difference between what activates and what sustains, between what produces the familiar intensity of the avoidant dynamic's particular register, and what produces something quieter and more real, and more genuinely compatible with a life that is being honestly, fully, sustainably inhabited. Honestly, fully, sustainably inhabited. Return to those words and let them be the measure, not the measure of perfection. Sustainable inhabitation is not the absence of difficulty or confusion, or the occasional drift back toward old patterns of thinking and feeling and relating. It is the presence of genuine, non-performed, unaudience-required engagement with the actual life you have, with the people in it who are genuinely present, with the work and the creativity and the questions that genuinely interest you, with the ordinary and the extraordinary and the unremarkable, and the beautiful and the difficult in proportions that are simply the proportions of a real life, neither inflated by the avoidant dynamics consuming demands, nor diminished by the absence of them. That life is not smaller than the one the dynamics seem to promise. It is larger, more genuinely available, more capable of receiving the full quality of your presence, because it is not organized around the management of someone else's unavailability. It is simply there, asking for you, in the full and ordinary and genuinely extraordinary form of a life that belongs to someone who has done the genuine, difficult, non-shortcuttable work of returning to herself after a significant departure. You did that work. You are doing it still. And the doing of it, however imperfect, however non-linear, however frequently interrupted by the ordinary human experiences of doubt and grief and the occasional surfacing of what was, is the most significant and the most genuinely valuable thing this entire experience has produced. Not the understanding of the avoidant. That was useful, clarifying, genuinely important for the specific work of extricating yourself from a dynamic whose logic was organized around keeping you in it. But the real thing, the thing underneath the understanding, the thing the understanding was always in service of, you, return to yourself, more honestly and more fully and more genuinely than before, carrying what the experience taught without being defined by what the experience cost, present in your own life with the specific, hard-won, unperformable quality of someone who has been through the full arc of something genuinely difficult, and arrived, not at a destination, at themselves, which was, in the end, the only arrival that was ever going to matter, the only one that was always, through everything, worth the journey. Here, fully, yours. Here is what remains to be said, and it does not require many words because the truest things rarely do. The avoidant silence hurt you. That is real. The withdrawal, the quiet exit, the absence of accountability, all of it produced real pain in a real person who deserved better than what they were given. Nothing in this entire examination changes that, or asks you to minimize it or reframe it into something more palatable than what it actually was. And you are here, still feeling, still thinking, still asking questions about yourself and about human psychology, and about what love requires and what it cannot fix. The fact that you are still here, still curious, still engaged with the genuine complexity of your own interior experience, rather than simply numbed past it, that is not nothing. That is, in fact, the evidence of the thing the avoidant silence was never able to reach. Your capacity, intact, operational, still asking to be used fully. The silence was supposed to be the final word. That is what silences are for, to end things without the cost of a conversation, to conclude without accountability, to leave without the vulnerability of a real goodbye. But you are still speaking, still thinking, still here in the full, feeling, genuinely alive sense of a person whose story did not end where someone else's silence tried to end it. That is the thing that will always hurt them more than their silence ever hurt you. Not your thriving as performance, not your fine as message, simply the fact that you continued, fully, without them, and without needing them to know it for it to be completely, quietly, irrevocably true.